Theron Mack woke to the smell of unfamiliar soil and the sound of people demanding explanations from an empty sky. His head felt packed with cotton, his mouth tasted like metal that shouldn't have been there, and when he sat up, 47 other humans were scattered across a clearing that had definitely not been his bedroom 7 hours ago. The trees surrounding them rose in twisted columns with bark that spiraled like genetic code, and the sky held two suns at angles that made his inner ear suggest lying back down immediately. An automated message began playing from somewhere overhead. No visible speakers, just sound that seemed to originate from the air itself. The voice was flat, translated through software that had given up on inflection. You have been selected for survival evaluation by the Galactic Concordance. Duration: 30 planetary rotations, approximately 42 standard Earth days. Parameters: organic materials only. Metal, synthetic polymers, composite materials, and refined chemicals are prohibited. Wood, stone, plant fibers, and bone are permitted. Your adaptability will be observed. Compliance is mandatory. Resources are adequate. Good luck. The message looped 3 more times while people shouted questions at nothing. Theron watched them instead of the sky. A woman in corporate casual wear demanding to speak with supervisors who weren't present. 2 men already squaring up, as though fistfights would resolve interstellar kidnapping. A teenager sitting very still with the expression of someone calculating terrible odds. Standard human panic response. Some freeze, some fight, some attempt to invoke bureaucratic structures that no longer applied. Theron had been a hydroponic technician on a colony station that supplied fresh vegetables to mining operations. Deeply boring work. He'd spent his off shifts reading historical accounts of Earth explorers who'd gotten spectacularly lost and either died or didn't. The difference between those outcomes usually came down to patience, specifically whether people observed their environment before making confident decisions that killed them. He'd absorbed these stories the way other people absorbed entertainment media, never expecting practical application, but finding the puzzle of survival more engaging than another evening of station gossip. He stood slowly, orienting himself. The clearing was roughly circular, 50 meters across, ringed by forest that looked deliberately arranged. The trees were wrong, in ways he couldn't immediately articulate, too uniform in their irregularity, like mathematical chaos rather than natural randomness. Fungal shelves jutted from trunks at precise intervals. The ground cover consisted of something between moss and carpet, blue-green and suspiciously even. Other people were beginning to organize, or attempting to. A man with a commanding voice was establishing himself as decision-maker through volume and repetition. Theron had seen this before. Stations always had someone who confused confidence with competence. The loud man was already assigning tasks: find water, build shelter, establish a perimeter, all reasonable goals delivered with the assumption that shouting created capability. Theron walked toward the tree line, while the loud man was explaining leadership qualifications to people who hadn't asked. Nobody stopped him. He reached the first trees and pressed his hand against spiral bark, feeling the texture, noting how it flaked in his palm. The wood underneath was dense, slightly oily. He scraped with a fingernail, hard enough to require effort. That mattered. Soft wood was easier to work but less durable. Hard wood took longer to shape but held edges better. A woman appeared beside him, middle-aged with hair tied back in a style that suggested functional impatience. She was also examining the trees, running her fingers along the spiral grain. "Kesa Imwe," she said without looking at him. "I designed database architecture for 17 years. Completely useless now." Theron Mack. "I grew vegetables in climate-controlled boxes. Also useless." At least vegetables are relevant. Nobody needs optimized data structures in a forest. She stepped back, tilting her head to track the canopy. Light patterns are wrong. Sun angle doesn't match Earth standard, and that second sun is going to complicate photosynthesis calculations. You're calculating photosynthesis. I calculate everything. It's a problem. She moved to the next tree, continuing her examination. What are you doing? Learning what we have to work with before making plans that depend on things we don't have. Kessa nodded slowly. Radical concept. The shouting man has already declared himself chief. I noticed. Are you going to challenge him? No. I'm going to let him be loud while I figure out which plants are edible and where water collects. Theron pressed deeper into the forest, finding a fallen log that showed internal structure. The wood was layered in alternating hard and soft bands, growth rings presumably, though the pattern was more complex than earth trees. You're welcome to help. I'll observe for now, see if your approach gets you killed first. Practical. She almost smiled. I'm very practical now that practicality is mandatory. The first 3 days proceeded without drama, which itself was noteworthy, given 48 humans had been dropped into an alien forest with no tools and competing survival philosophies. The loud man, his name turned out to be Garrett Voss, former security director, had established a camp near the clearing center with 12 followers who appreciated clear hierarchies. They'd built shelters from branches and broad leaves, created a communal fire pit, and posted watch rotations. All reasonable activities executed with more enthusiasm than expertise. Their shelters leaked. Their fire required constant attention. Their watch rotations left people exhausted and irritable. Theron spent those days walking slowly through the forest with no apparent purpose, which several people mentioned looked like laziness. He ignored them. He was tracking how morning light moved across the forest floor, where dew collected heaviest on vegetation, which trees showed signs of small animal activity, scratch marks, disturbed bark, scattered droppings. He noted where streams ran, testing water clarity and flow rate. He tasted plants with extreme caution, a small amount on skin first, waiting for reactions, then lips, then tongue tip, then spitting out, waiting hours between each test. Most things tasted terrible, but caused no obvious harm. Kessa followed similar patterns, though her observations skewed towards spatial relationships and angles. She spent an entire afternoon calculating sun positions with shadow sticks, creating a crude sundial that let her estimate time without checking her non-existent devices. She caught him watching and shrugged. If I can't have my systems, I'll build new ones from sticks. It's that or accept that I don't know what time it is, and I find that psychologically intolerable. Fair enough. You're mapping game trails. Starting to. There's something small that drinks from the North Stream at dawn. Leaves tracks like a three-toed chicken had delusions of grandeur. Moves in pairs usually. Protein source. Eventually, need to understand its patterns first. Hunting something you don't understand is called starving with extra steps. Other survivors had already attempted hunting, which mostly involved throwing rocks at anything that moved and being disappointed by consistent failure. One man had fashioned a spear from a straight branch and managed to stab himself in the foot during an enthusiastic lunge. The camp's healer, a woman who'd been a nurse and now served as their closest thing to medical infrastructure, had bandaged him with plant fibers and expressed opinions about human intelligence that seemed broadly applicable. By day 7, Theron had enough observational data to attempt construction. He selected a tree with relatively straight grain, using rocks to pound wedges into the wood, until he could split off workable sections. The process was slow and loud. Several people stopped to watch, offering advice that ranged from helpful to physically impossible. He was building a deadfall trap, ancient technology, elegantly simple, a flat rock balanced on notched trigger sticks, baited underneath. Animal disturbs bait, triggers collapse, rock falls, in theory. In practice, the trigger sensitivity required careful calibration. Too loose and wind collapsed it, too tight, and animals simply stole bait without consequence. His first attempt fell apart immediately, wrong angle on the trigger notch. The second stood but proved too stable, ignoring even deliberate bait removal. The third showed promise but collapsed overnight for mysterious reasons, possibly wind, possibly local fauna. Investigating the strange wooden structure, Kessa appeared during his fourth attempt, carrying her own split wood and looking thoughtful. "Weight distribution problem," she said, crouching beside his arrangement. "Your trigger stick is bearing load unevenly. The notch needs to be deeper on one side to account for the rock's center of mass." "You calculated the rock's center of mass?" "I estimated based on visual density variations. Do you want help or do you want to be proud?" "Help is good." They rebuilt together, adjusting angles based on Kessa's spatial reasoning and Theron's practical experience, with things that fell over versus things that didn't. The fifth attempt stood properly, balanced in that precarious way that suggested functionality. They baited it with fungus that the three-toed creatures seemed to favor and retreated to watch from a distance. Nothing happened for hours. Theron had expected this. Animals needed time to accept new objects in their environment. But other humans had gathered to watch, and their patience expired quickly. Most returned to camp, declaring the trap useless. Garrett Voss stopped by to mention that his team would be establishing proper hunting parties instead of playing with sticks like children. Theron nodded politely and continued watching. Just before dusk, one of the three-toed creatures approached cautiously, sniffing the air. It circled the trap twice, demonstrating survival instincts that Theron respected. Then it darted forward, grabbed the bait, and the trap collapsed with a satisfying wooden thunk. The rock pinned it cleanly. Dead instantly, no suffering. Kessa made a quiet, satisfied sound. That actually worked. Iterative problem-solving usually does. Theron approached slowly, examining the result. The creature was roughly rabbit-sized, covered in iridescent scales, absolutely alien and absolutely edible. Probably. He'd test that assumption carefully. By day 12, 8 functional traps operated at different locations throughout the surrounding forest. Theron had shared his design freely when asked, walking people through trigger construction and explaining calibration principles. Some people built their own variations, improving on his template. A woman named Sari developed a smaller version for lighter prey. A man called Orin created a fish trap variation that worked in the streams. The camp began to smell less like desperation and more like a place where people had regular access to protein. Garrett Voss's hunting parties continued with mixed success. Throwing spears at fast-moving targets had a learning curve measured in weeks of empty hands. But the traps worked consistently, requiring only patience and proper placement. With food supply stabilizing, other organizational needs became apparent. Specifically, their camp was a disaster. Sleeping areas mixed with food preparation, mixed with tool storage, mixed with waste disposal, creating a concentration of smells that attracted scavengers and made everything slightly worse than necessary. Theron proposed a central workspace away from sleeping shelters, citing pest reduction and efficiency gains. Kessa supported this with spatial calculations, showing optimal distances for various activities. Garrett initially resisted. He'd established the current camp layout and took suggestions as criticism, but enough people were tired of waking up covered in insects that democracy briefly functioned. They constructed the workspace over 3 days, a raised platform of split logs for cleaning game and preventing ground contamination, vertical racks made from branches for drying meat, a separate fire pit with better ventilation using hollow reeds as air channels. Theron discovered that green branches could be bent into clamps that tightened as they dried, holding projects in place while he worked. Kessa found that certain wood produced almost no smoke when burned, superior for cooking applications where breathing mattered. The camp developed routines that emerged organically from practical necessity rather than imposed structure. Morning trap checks by whoever woke first. Afternoon material gathering in rotating pairs. Evening tool maintenance around the fire, where people shared techniques they'd discovered. Someone found that certain leaves produced decent cordage when processed correctly. Someone else determined which stones held edges longest when shaped. Or in Sable, who'd coordinated logistics for a mining operation in his previous life, implemented a resource-sharing system using wooden tokens. Each token represented contributed labor, trap construction, material gathering, food preparation. People could trade tokens for specialized services or items. It wasn't currency exactly, more like formalized reciprocity. Not everyone participated. 3 people maintained independent camps at the forest's edge, visiting occasionally to trade, but preferring isolation. The group didn't force inclusion. They left surplus materials where the holdouts could find them, extra cordage, dried food, worked wood. Humans, Theron noted, could organize cooperation even among people who preferred not to cooperate. It was inefficient but functional, which described most human systems when examined honestly. The predator announced itself on day 16, with the sound of traps being systematically destroyed. Theron went to investigate at dawn and found 3 of his carefully calibrated deadfalls scattered across the forest floor. Trigger mechanisms snapped, bait stones overturned. Something low and quick had torn through them with deliberate malice or impressive clumsiness. Tracks in the soft ground suggested the former, 4-legged, each foot showing 5 curved claws, stride pattern indicating muscular build and speed. The creature was testing their infrastructure, learning about these strange bipeds who'd invaded its territory. That night it circled their camp, staying just beyond firelight, making low rumbling sounds that caused several people to suggest leaving the planet immediately. Since that wasn't optional, panic yielded to practical concern. They needed defensive tools. Theron had avoided weapon construction deliberately. Traps fed people without requiring direct confrontation, and he'd read enough survival accounts to know that armed humans often shot themselves before shooting anything useful. But defensive capability seemed prudent when something large was treating their camp as a curiosity worth investigating. He started with spears, attempting fire-hardened points using techniques from historical texts. The first batch split immediately upon heating, wrong wood density. The second hardened but remained too brittle, shattering against test rocks. The third iteration used naturally dense wood from the spiral bark trees, shaped with abrasive stones rather than fire. These held up better, though calling them weapons was generous. They were pointed sticks that might convince something to reconsider, which was probably sufficient. Kessa approached the problem from a different angle. Literally, she'd been studying leverage mechanics, how force multiplied through properly designed tools, and applied this to throwing weapons. Her atlatl design used a curved wooden launcher to extend arm length artificially, increasing projectile velocity significantly. The first test threw a stick 40 meters with enough force to embed it in a tree trunk. "Physics," she said with satisfaction, "still works even when everything else is terrible." They didn't hunt the predator aggressively. Theron had no interest in starting a war with something that knew this terrain better than they did. Instead, they established clear boundaries, noisemakers at camp perimeter, fire kept high at night, weapons stacked visibly near the camp's edge as deterrence rather than invitation. The message was simple: easier prey exists elsewhere. These particular bipeds are more trouble than they're worth. The approach worked through sheer boring consistency. The predator tested their defenses twice more, found them alert and prepared both times, and apparently decided that something else in this forest was less organizationally annoying. Its visits became infrequent, then stopped entirely. The weapons remained stacked and maintained, but used more often for tool production than actual defense. Violence existed in their camp as potential rather than practice, which seemed optimally human, preparing for conflict while preferring not to engage in it. Beyond survival lay the human impulse toward comfort, which arrived right on schedule once nobody was actively starving. Someone began weaving reed mats for sleeping, explaining that dirt was uncomfortable, and she'd always hated camping even when camping was voluntary. Someone else carved handles for frequently used tools, adding finger grooves that reduced blisters and improved grip ergonomics. These weren't survival necessities, they were quality of life improvements, the eternal human project of making adequate things slightly better. Theron found himself developing an improved bow design after discovering wood with superior spring tension during a material survey. He didn't need a better bow. His current bow functioned adequately for the hunting they actually did, but the new wood's properties suggested performance gains, and apparently he was physically incapable of encountering engineering problems without attempting solutions. Kessa caught him testing the prototype and shook her head with something resembling fondness. "You're proving my theory." "Which theory?" "That humans can't stop optimizing. We've achieved survival. We have food, shelter, water, functional society. But instead of relaxing, you're building a better bow that you don't need, and I'm perfecting a drill mechanism that solves problems we don't have." She gestured toward her current project, a bow-driven spindle for drilling consistent holes through wood, dramatically more efficient than hand-twisting. "I hate manual labor. Spent my entire career avoiding physical work. Now I'm voluntarily inventing tools for working wood more effectively. What's wrong with us? We're bored." "No. Bored implies we want entertainment. This is different. We've reached sustainable survival, and instead of stopping, we're building infrastructure for a civilization we'll only inhabit for another 2 weeks. It's compulsive." Theron tested the bow's draw weight, making minor adjustments. Maybe stopping isn't what humans do. We iterate. It's probably why we left Earth in the first place, got bored with one planet, decided to complicate things unnecessarily by spreading to others. Optimistic interpretation. Alternative theory. We're deeply broken and express it through perpetual dissatisfaction with functional systems. That's also possible. The camp had evolved past survival into something resembling intentional community. Specialized areas emerged through organic use patterns, a weaving space where collected fibers were organized by thickness and flexibility, a tool-making corner with various abrasive stones arranged by grit, a cooking area with different fire configurations for smoking versus roasting versus boiling in bark containers. Someone had started a small garden of useful plants near their water collection system, transplanting specimens for easier access. Someone else had created a primitive calendar by carving marks into a standing post. They'd built elaboration from simplicity because humans apparently couldn't help themselves. On day 30, the automated message returned with timing that suggested observation rather than preset scheduling. Evaluation complete. Transport vessels descending. Remain in cleared areas for collection. Ships materialized from nothing. Sudden presence without approach. Technology so advanced that arrival and existence were simultaneous. Ramps extended. Alien observers emerged. Tall beings with too many joints in their limbs and smooth faces that suggested eyes existed somewhere not immediately obvious. They walked through the camp slowly, recording devices held in what might have been hands. They examined traps with what seemed like careful attention, tested weapon balance, photographed the organized workspace from multiple angles. One observer crouched beside Kessa's drill mechanism for several minutes, manipulating its components with delicate precision. Through translation devices that rendered their speech in flat automated tones, Theron heard them commenting to each other. Infrastructure development, unexpected. Cooperative labor distribution, noteworthy. Systematic environmental analysis before resource exploitation, unusual approach. One observer approached Theron directly, holding its recording device at what was probably polite distance. The translation came with slight delay. Question for documentation. Your species possessed significant individual survival capability. Statistical models predicted competitive resource hoarding for maximum personal advantage. Instead, you built collective infrastructure and shared technical knowledge. Explain reasoning. Theron considered his answer. Individual survival is statistically inferior to cooperative systems when cognitive overhead can be distributed. One person can build a trap. 48 people can build a working camp. The mathematics favored cooperation. Other species prioritize individual survival despite mathematical disadvantage. Other species aren't human. We're social to the point of being problematic about it. Put us in a forest alone, and we'll organize a society just to have someone to argue with. The observer made a sound that the translator didn't attempt to render. It touched something on its device. Response noted for DAN analysis. They documented everything, measured building angles, cataloged tool designs, collected samples of worked materials. Theron watched them work with the strange detachment that came from being studied like bacterial cultures under observation. The observers seemed surprised, which itself was interesting. What had they expected? Humans tearing each other apart for resources. Individuals cowering in makeshift shelters waiting for rescue. Maybe most species did that. Maybe cooperation was rarer than humanity assumed. As transport ships loaded the survivors for return to their various lives, Theron found himself standing at the clearing's edge with Kessa, looking back at the camp they were leaving behind. The traps still functioned. He could see one in the distance, properly set, ready for prey that wouldn't come. The workspace remained organized, tools arranged by type and size. Someone's garden showed new growth near the water collection system. We built a civilization, Kessa said quietly. Small one, temporary, but functional, from nothing but wood and stubbornness. We did. In another month we'd probably be arguing about property rights and taxation. Probably human scale indefinitely. Small camp, large city, interstellar civilization. Same problems, different scale. She smiled slightly. Encouraging thought. Not really, but it's honest. They boarded the transport with the others, the camp shrinking behind them as the ship lifted. Theron watched it disappear into the alien forest, wondering how long the structures would last before weather or local fauna reclaimed the clearing. Probably not long. Wood was temporary. Organization was temporary. Everything was temporary given sufficient time. But they'd built it anyway, because that's what humans did when left with time, materials, and problems to solve. The Galactic Concordance had wanted to test human adaptability without technology, measuring whether humans could survive when stripped of metal and synthetics and refined materials. But they'd fundamentally misunderstood what human technology actually was. It wasn't the metal or the synthetics. Those were just expressions of something deeper: pattern recognition applied to environmental problems, systematic testing of hypotheses, compulsive organization of available resources, the complete inability to stop improving functional systems once they reached good enough. The wood was never the limitation. The wood was just the medium. Humans would have built traps and working camps from whatever was permitted: wood or stone or ice or crystallized atmospheric gas, because building systems wasn't what humans did when given resources. Building systems was what humans were, stripped down to cognitive fundamentals. The observers would file their reports, noting with academic surprise that humans had created infrastructure instead of merely surviving. They would add this data to their archives, updating their models of species behavior, recalculating predictions for how humanity might function in their broader concordance. And somewhere in those reports, buried in statistical analysis and observational notes, would be the uncomfortable implication that perhaps the concordance itself, with its rules and evaluations and organized hierarchies, was the most human thing in the galaxy. Which would have been funny if it weren't so completely predictable.